That's it. You're done. I'm arresting you for obstruction of justice, resisting arrest, and felony assault on a police officer. You touched me when you got out of the car. I felt it.
The silence in the parking lot was almost absolute. It was the kind of quiet that only settles over a sprawling expanse of asphalt on a Tuesday afternoon, a midweek lull where the world seems to take a collective breath. The sun, a pale yellow disk in the high, cloudless sky, baked the empty spaces, making heat shimmer rise in wavy lines from the dark surface. This was the back lot of the Northwood Professional Plaza, a place intentionally designed for anonymity and discretion, servicing a collection of law offices, financial planners, and therapists. It was a place people came to solve problems, not to find them. And for Imani Thompson, sitting in the driver's seat of her impeccably clean Lexus sedan, that silence was a welcome reward. Just an hour earlier, she had been in the thick of it, navigating the dense, often frustrating corridors of a civil deposition. As a civil rights attorney, her days were a tapestry of high-stakes arguments, meticulous research, and the emotional weight of her client's struggles. Today had been a victory. She had secured a favorable settlement for a young man who had been wrongfully terminated from his job, a small but significant battle won in the endless war against systemic injustice. Now, all she wanted was a few minutes to decompress before plunging back into the digital sea of emails and case files waiting for her. She had leaned her head back against the leather headrest, closed her eyes, and let the quiet wash over her. At 36, Imani had cultivated a presence of unshakable calm, a necessary armor in her line of work. She was tall, with a posture that radiated confidence without aggression, her hair styled in elegant professional braids. Today, she wore a charcoal gray pantsuit, the very picture of a woman in command of her world. Nothing about her suggested she was anyone to be trifled with. 100 feet away, parked at an oblique angle near the single, scraggly oak tree that offered the lot's only shade, a police cruiser sat like a predator in repose. Inside, Officer Kevin Miller, 38, tapped a restless rhythm on the steering wheel with his thumb. Miller had the blocky, thick-necked build of a former high school football player who hadn't missed a day at the gym since graduation, but his face was starting to show the puffiness of a man who enjoyed his weekends a little too much. His partner, Officer David Davis, 32, was slouched in the passenger seat, scrolling idly through his phone. Davis was leaner, with a perpetually bored expression and the kind of smirk that suggested he found the entire world faintly amusing and beneath him. They were on the tail end of a long, uneventful shift. No major calls, no exciting chases, just a monotonous loop through the quiet, affluent suburbs of Westlake. It was the kind of day that bred a specific type of restlessness in men like them, a desire to make something happen. Miller's gaze drifted across the lot and settled on Imani's Lexus. A nice car. A very nice car in a very nice part of town. He watched her for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Look at this," he murmured, nudging Davis with his elbow. Davis glanced up from his phone, his expression uninterested. "What? Lady in a car, big deal." "Nah, look closer," Miller insisted, his voice taking on a conspiratorial edge. "Been sitting there for 10 minutes, hasn't moved, just sitting there, in that car." The implication hung heavy in the air between them. It was the unspoken language of bias, a narrative they told themselves so often it had become fact. A black woman in a luxury car in this neighborhood, parked in an empty lot, doing nothing? To them, the equation was simple: suspicious. It didn't matter that she was dressed like a CEO or that the car was pristine. In their minds, the pieces didn't fit their worldview, and anything that didn't fit was a potential problem to be prodded. "So, maybe she's on the phone," Davis said, ready to dismiss it. But Miller was already shifting the cruiser into drive. The boredom in his eyes had been replaced by a faint glimmer of predatory excitement. This was better than writing parking tickets. This was a chance to engage, to assert, to remind someone of the established order of things. "Let's go say hi," Miller said, the words sounding more like a decision than a suggestion. Let's just make sure everything's okay over here." Davis sighed and put his phone away, a reluctant participant now drawn into his partner's manufactured drama. He knew what this was about. It was Miller's favorite pastime, the casual check-in that was never casual. It was about leveraging the weight of the badge and the power of the uniform to poke at people he felt were out of place. It was a small, petty abuse of power, but it was an abuse all the same, and it was how they passed the slow hours on a Tuesday afternoon. As the patrol car rolled silently across the sun-drenched asphalt, its shadow stretching long and dark in front of it, Imani opened her eyes. The sound of the engine, though quiet, had pierced her moment of peace. She saw the cruiser approaching in her rearview mirror, its slow, deliberate pace setting off a familiar, low-level alarm in her gut. It was the instinct every black person in America learns to develop, a sixth sense for when the mundane is about to curdle into the menacing. She sat up straight, her hands resting calmly on the steering wheel, and watched as the blue and white car pulled up and parked directly behind her, blocking any possibility of exit. The silent, peaceful parking lot was no longer either of those things. It was now a stage, and Imani knew, with a certainty that chilled her despite the afternoon heat, that she had just been cast in a role she had never asked for. The trap had been set. The heavy thunk of two car doors closing in unison broke the quiet. Imani watched in her side mirror as Miller and Davis emerged from their vehicle, their movements filled with a practiced, deliberate casualness that was anything but. Miller adjusted his utility belt, his hand lingering for a moment near his sidearm, a classic intimidation tactic. Davis put on his sunglasses, creating a mirrored, impersonal barrier. They didn't approach her driver's side window. Instead, they took a slow, meandering path around the back of her car, their boots scuffing lightly on the asphalt, before stopping near the rear bumper of their own cruiser. They were creating a scene, establishing a perimeter. Imani remained perfectly still, her hands at 10 and 2 on the wheel, her mind already shifting from peaceful reflection to legal analysis. She ran through the checklist. She wasn't speeding, her registration was current, she had no outstanding warrants. She was legally parked in a public space. There was no legitimate reason for this stop. Therefore, it had to be a pretext. Miller pointed a thick finger towards the front passenger side bumper of the patrol car. He leaned over, squinting with theatrical focus, then looked back at Davis and shook his head with an air of profound disappointment. Davis mirrored the gesture, peering at the same spot. From her vantage point, Imani couldn't see what they were looking at, but she didn't need to. The performance was clear. They were building a narrative before they had even spoken a single word to her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of this silent play, Miller began his approach. He walked not to her window, but to the front of her car, forcing her to turn her head uncomfortably to see him. He stood there for a moment, arms crossed, just staring at her through the windshield. It was another power play, designed to unnerve, to make her feel scrutinized and trapped. Imani lowered her window, the quiet hum of the electric motor sounding deafeningly loud in the tense silence. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice even and calm, betraying none of the frustration simmering beneath the surface. Miller strolled to her window, leaning down and placing one hand on the roof of her car, invading her personal space. "Ma'am, I was hoping you could tell me," he said, his voice a low, gravelly drawl that dripped with condescension. "You in a bit of a hurry today?" Imani's eyebrows knitted together in genuine confusion. "A hurry? No, I've been parked here for about 10 minutes. "Is that right?" Miller said, a disbelieving smirk playing on his lips. "Because it looks to us like you were in such a rush pulling into this spot that you got a little too friendly with our patrol car." The accusation was so ludicrous, so transparently false, that Imani almost laughed. She had pulled into this spot with meticulous care, reversing in to face the exit, with at least 15 feet of empty space around her in every direction. The patrol car had parked behind her. It was a physical impossibility. "Officer, with all due respect, I was nowhere near your vehicle," she stated, keeping her tone respectful but firm. "You parked behind me after I was already stationary." Davis, who had now ambled over to stand a few feet behind Miller, chimed in. "We saw the whole thing, ma'am. We saw you swing in wide and heard the scrape. Figured we'd give you a chance to make it right before we write it up as a hit and run." A hit and run. The word was a deliberate escalation, a piece of legal jargon thrown out to intimidate and disorient. They were accusing her of a criminal offense. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. This was no longer just a pretext stop. This was an active fabrication of evidence. Imani took a slow, deliberate breath. This was a test. They wanted a reaction. They wanted her to get angry, to yell, to give them an excuse to escalate further, to pull her out of the car. She refused to give them the satisfaction. "Officers, I can assure you that did not happen," she said, her voice dropping into the precise, measured cadence she used in the courtroom. "Perhaps you could show me the damage you're referring to." Miller's smirk widened. He seemed to be enjoying this. "We'd be happy to. Why don't you step out of the vehicle, ma'am?" He hadn't asked, he had commanded. But Imani knew her rights. They had no probable cause to order her out of the vehicle. "I'd prefer to remain in my car, thank you," she replied politely. "You can point to the alleged damage from where you are." Miller's face hardened, the thin veneer of feigned civility evaporating. The game wasn't going according to his script. She wasn't flustered, she wasn't scared. She was calm and articulate, and it was clearly irritating him. "Ma'am, I need you to step out of the car now," he said, his voice losing its drawl and gaining a sharp, authoritative edge. "We need to investigate a traffic collision, and you are a party to it. It's not a request." This was the critical juncture. He was giving her an unlawful order. Refusing it could give him the pretext he needed to physically remove her. Complying meant surrendering the relative safety of her car and placing herself at their mercy in an empty parking lot. She looked from Miller's tightening jaw to Davis's smug, silent posture. She saw the glint in their eyes, the look of men who were used to getting their way, who saw her not as a citizen with rights, but as an obstacle to their authority, a problem to be solved. They believed they held all the cards. They had the badges, the guns, and what they thought was the unassailable cover of a deserted location. They were confident that whatever happened next would be their word against hers. And in their world, that was no contest at all. Imani's mind raced, assessing options and calculating risks. And in that split second, a plan began to form. A plan that would take their perceived advantage, the isolation of the empty parking lot, and turn it into their greatest liability. "All right, officer," Imani said, her voice softening just enough to signal cooperation. "Let me just grab my purse." Miller nodded, a flicker of triumph in his eyes. He had won. She was complying. He took a half step back from the car door, giving her space, confident that the confrontation was now on his terms. Davis remained in his position, a silent sentinel of intimidation. They watched her lean over towards the passenger seat, assuming she was reaching for her handbag, as she'd said. But Imani's movements were a study in practiced misdirection. Her purse was on the seat, yes, but her target was the smartphone resting in the car's charging cradle next to it. With one swift, fluid motion, her thumb unlocked the screen, swiped to her most used app, and tapped the prominent Go Live button. She had the app pre-configured for situations like this, a grim necessity of her life and work. The stream's title was already set. Unlawful traffic stop in progress, badge numbers pending. A tiny red icon appeared in the top corner of her screen, pulsing faintly. A counter, currently at 0 viewers, materialized next to it. She angled the phone just so in its cradle, ensuring the camera had a clear, wide-angle view through the driver's side window, capturing Miller perfectly and catching Davis in the frame just behind him. The phone's built-in microphone was sensitive enough to pick up every word clearly. Then, and only then, did she pick up her purse, her movements calm and unhurried. The entire sequence took less than 5 seconds. To the officers watching, it looked like a woman simply grabbing her bag. They had no idea that they were now the lead actors in a broadcast that was being beamed out to the world. As she turned back, she glanced at the screen. The viewer count was already climbing. 17, 48, 112. Her network of fellow activists, lawyers, and community organizers had notifications enabled for her streams. They were the digital first responders. The numbers began to multiply exponentially as they shared the link. By the time she turned to face Miller again, over 500 people were watching. "Okay," she said, her voice perfectly steady. "I'm ready." She opened the car door and swung her legs out, planting her feet firmly on the ground. She stood up slowly, her 5'9" frame making her nearly eye level with Miller. She held her purse in one hand, her keys in the other, and left the car door open, ensuring the phone's view remained unobstructed. "Now," Miller said, gesturing grandly towards the front of his cruiser, "let's go take a look at what you did." Imani walked with him, her steps measured. She was acutely aware of the camera behind her, of the silent audience bearing witness. Every word, every action was now evidence. They stopped at the patrol car's bumper. Miller pointed to a spot on the white plastic. There, barely visible, was a tiny black scuff mark, no bigger than a thumbnail. It was the kind of insignificant blemish that any car accumulates within a week of leaving the dealership. It looked more like a bug smear or a scuff from a shopping cart than anything a car could have caused. "There," Miller said, his voice filled with fake gravity. "You see that? You took the paint right off. That's city property you just damaged." Imani looked at the minuscule mark, then back at his face, her expression one of polite skepticism. "Officer, that's a scuff mark. It could have come from anywhere. There is absolutely no paint transfer from my vehicle, which is dark gray. This is clearly not from my car." "Oh, I think it is," Davis chimed in, stepping forward to join them. "And I think you know it is. People like you think you can just do whatever you want, drive in your fancy cars, and that the rules don't apply." The comment was a direct escalation, a shift from a fabricated traffic incident to a personal, racially charged attack. "People like me?" Imani repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. She turned her head just slightly, ensuring her face was angled towards her car, letting her unseen audience hear the question and the loaded silence that followed. On the screen of her phone, the comment section was a waterfall of furious text. "Racist cops! This is a setup! Someone get the department's number!" The viewer count had just passed 3,000. People were screen recording, sharing the link to Twitter, to Facebook, to local news media pages. A digital firestorm was brewing, completely unknown to the two men who were smugly enjoying their power trip under the afternoon sun. Miller ignored her question, pressing his advantage. "So here's how this is going to go. You can give us your license and insurance information, we'll write up a report, and the city's insurance will be in touch. Or we can arrest you for fleeing the scene of an accident and destruction of city property. Your choice, but I'd decide quick." He thought he was presenting her with an ultimatum, cornering her into admitting fault for something she didn't do. He believed he was in total control of the narrative. What he didn't understand was that he wasn't in control of anything. He was no longer an authority figure conducting a stop in an empty lot. He was an exhibit. He and his partner were evidence, their own words and actions building a case against them in real time for an audience that was growing by the second, serving as a massive, invisible jury. The camera kept rolling, the red light pulsing like a steady heartbeat, capturing it all. Believing they had successfully cornered their target, the officer's demeanor shifted from aggressive interrogation to smug condescension. They were confident in their isolation, cocooned by the empty parking lot and the authority of their uniforms. This perceived privacy made them reckless, allowing the ugliness they normally kept veiled to surface. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Miller taunted, a broad, unpleasant smile spreading across his face. "Usually you people are so quick to run your mouths. Now you're all quiet." The phrase, "you people," was a classic, well-worn tool of casual racism, designed to demean and generalize. He was enjoying her silence, misinterpreting her calculated composure as fear or submission. It fed his ego, reinforcing the power fantasy he was constructing. Davis, leaning against the patrol car with his arms crossed, let out a short, sharp laugh. "Give her a break, Kev. She's probably trying to remember which lie she's going to tell next. Or maybe trying to figure out if she can afford the ticket and the repair bill on our car. That Lexus payment must be steep. Their words were a performance for each other as much as they were an attack on Imani. It was a bonding ritual, a way of reinforcing their shared worldview on the job. They saw themselves as the guardians of a certain order, and Imani, in their eyes, was a disruption to that order. Her success, her confidence, her refusal to be intimidated, it all grated on their sense of how things were supposed to be. And so they resorted to mockery, trying to chip away at her dignity piece by piece. Imani listened to their jeers, her expression unreadable. Inside, a cold fury was building, but on the outside, she was a statue of composure. She knew that her every reaction was being broadcast. Getting angry would only give them ammunition. Crying would give them satisfaction. Her most powerful weapon was her refusal to break. She let their insults hang in the air, each one a self-inflicted wound that they were too blind to see. "I'm just waiting for you to provide me with a lawful reason for this detention, officers," she said finally, her tone as placid as a frozen lake. "You've made an accusation that is physically impossible, and now you're resorting to insults. I'd like to see your badge numbers, please." The request, perfectly legal and standard, seemed to genuinely annoy them. It was a reminder that she knew the rules, that she wasn't some uninformed citizen they could easily railroad. Miller's smile vanished. "We'll get to that. First, you need to show us some respect. We're the ones in charge here, not you." He took a step closer, lowering his voice into a menacing growl. "You see, out here there's no lawyers, no judges. There's just us and you. And right now we say you hit our car, so you hit our car. Understand?" This was the heart of it, the raw, unfiltered abuse of power. It was a threat predicated on the belief that no one was watching. The empty parking lot was their kingdom, and their word was law. Meanwhile, Imani's phone, still perched in its cradle, was telling a very different story. The viewer count had swelled past 10,000. The live stream was now the top trending video on several platforms. The comment section was a blur of frantic activity. Users were identifying the police department from the markings on the car. Someone had already looked up the precinct's non-emergency number and the direct line to the Internal Affairs Division, and dozens of people were reporting that they were calling in. A news reporter from a local ABC affiliate posted a comment, "We are watching and on our way." The digital world was converging on this single, isolated spot. A silent, invisible army mobilizing in defense of a woman who was standing her ground alone. "I understand that you are making threats," Imani said, her voice clear and unwavering. "And I understand that you are conducting an unlawful stop. I will ask you one more time for your badge numbers and for you to call your supervisor to this scene." Davis scoffed. "Supervisor? For a little fender bender? I don't think so. You're wasting our time, lady. Either give us the license or put your hands behind your back. It's your last chance." He pushed himself off the car and took a step towards her, his posture shifting into one of active aggression. He was preparing to make an arrest, to end this game and reassert their dominance once and for all. They were so caught up in their own drama, so sure of their unchecked authority, that they missed the subtle signs that their world was about to come crashing down. They didn't hear the distant, faint sound of approaching sirens, not from a police car, but from the news van that was racing towards their location. They didn't feel the thousands of pairs of eyes watching their every move through the tiny lens of a smartphone. They stood there, two men convinced of their power, completely oblivious to the fact that their careers were bleeding out, live, on the sun-baked asphalt of the Northwood Professional Plaza parking lot. They were alone, just as they wanted to be, but they were also on display for the entire world. While Miller and Davis were engrossed in their small-time tyranny, the digital shockwaves from Imani's live stream were building into a tsunami. The phenomenon of a viral moment is often described as unpredictable, but this one had all the ingredients for an explosion. A clear injustice, compelling characters, a calm, articulate victim and two openly hostile antagonists, and the real-time tension of an unfolding confrontation. The initial viewers, Imani's core network, had acted as the kindling. They didn't just watch, they acted. A group chat of civil rights lawyers across the state lit up with the link. Imani Thompson is being harassed. Westlake PD. Someone get eyes on her. Another lawyer, a man named Marcus, who had clerked with Imani years ago, immediately began a parallel process. He wasn't just watching the stream, he was documenting it, taking screenshots of the officers, running their faces through databases to try and identify them, and preparing the groundwork for the legal battle he knew was coming. Simultaneously, the link spread to activist circles on Twitter and Facebook. Hashtags were born organically. Hashtag Westlake PD. Hashtag Parking Lot Stop. Hashtag Watching Imani. The viewer count on the stream was no longer climbing, it was launching. 20,000, 35,000, 50,000. Each new viewer was a potential witness and a potential amplifier. The comment section became a command center. People in Westlake were offering to drive to the location. Others were coordinating a mass call campaign. Everyone call the watch commander's office. Be polite but firm. State the facts. 2 of your officers are currently engaged in what appears to be an unlawful and racially motivated stop, which is being live-streamed by the victim. Don't yell, just report. The Westlake Police Department's dispatch center was completely unprepared for the deluge. The first call came in from a woman in California, her voice trembling with anger as she described what she was seeing on her computer screen. The dispatcher, a veteran named Sharon, was initially confused, thinking it was a prank. But then a second call came in, and a third. Within 5 minutes, every single one of their incoming lines was lit up. The calls were coming from everywhere: New York, Florida, Texas, even a few from Canada and the UK. "We're getting flooded with calls about a live stream," Sharon announced over the dispatch floor's intercom, her voice tight with urgency. "Something about 2 of our officers in the Northwood Plaza lot. Anyone have eyes on Unit 714? Unit 714 was Miller and Davis. The dispatcher's request sent a ripple of confusion through the room. The unit hadn't called in a stop. They hadn't reported any activity at all. They were, according to their logs, on routine patrol. A supervisor, Sergeant Frank Reynolds, hurried over to Sharon's station. "What's going on?" he demanded. "They're saying Miller and Davis are harassing a woman, sir, accusing her of a hit and run. The callers are saying it's all on video, live, right now." Reynolds felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Miller and Davis. Of all the officers on his shift, it had to be them. He'd had informal talks with both of them before about their overly aggressive tactics and the number of citizen complaints they generated, complaints that always ended up as unfounded due to a lack of evidence. "Get me a link to this stream," Reynolds commanded. A younger, tech-savvy dispatcher already had it on his monitor. He turned the screen towards Reynolds. The sergeant leaned in and his blood ran cold. There, on the screen, clear as day, were his 2 officers. He saw Miller lean into the woman's personal space, heard his voice dripping with menace as he said, "Out here there's no lawyers, no judges. There's just us and you." Reynolds physically recoiled from the monitor as if he'd been struck. He didn't need to see any more. He had a 5-alarm fire on his hands, a public relations apocalypse happening in real time, and 2 of his own men were holding the matches. The ripple effect was no longer just digital. It had breached the walls of the precinct. The consequences were no longer theoretical or distant. They were imminent and barreling down on everyone involved. While Miller and Davis thought they were writing a traffic ticket, the world was writing their career obituaries. And Sergeant Reynolds knew he was the one who was going to have to deliver them. He grabbed his radio, his knuckles white. The time for quiet chats was over. Back in the parking lot, the tension had reached a breaking point. Miller and Davis, completely insulated from the digital hurricane they had caused, saw only one thing: a woman defying their authority. Imani's persistent calm and her refusal to be baited had shredded their patience. The game was no longer fun. It was time to end it. "Last chance," Miller repeated, his voice now flat and devoid of its earlier taunting quality. It was the voice of a man who had made a decision. License and registration, now. Not until you call your supervisor, officer, Imani replied, her gaze unwavering. She held his eyes, refusing to look away, refusing to show a flicker of fear. She was not just a victim, she was a combatant in a legal arena, and this parking lot was her courtroom. That quiet defiance was the final straw. Miller's face contorted in a mask of pure fury. All pretense of procedure, of law and order, evaporated in the heat of his rage. He had been challenged, and his authority, in his mind, was absolute. "That's it. You're done," he snarled. He reached for his handcuffs. "You want to play lawyer? Fine. You can play lawyer from a jail cell." He then uttered the words that would be replayed on national news for weeks to come, the sentence that would form the core of the prosecution's case against him. "I'm arresting you for obstruction of justice, resisting arrest, and felony assault on a police officer. You touched me when you got out of the car. I felt it." It was a monstrous, transparent lie. Imani hadn't laid a finger on him. She had maintained a careful distance at all times. He was fabricating a felony charge on the spot, a charge that could land someone in prison for years, simply because his ego was bruised. He wasn't just bending the law anymore, he was shattering it and attempting to piece together the shards into a weapon. Davis moved to flank her, positioning himself to assist in the arrest. They moved with a synchronized, practiced aggression, two predators closing in on their prey. On the live stream, the viewer count had just crested 75,000. When Miller spoke those words, "felony assault on a police officer," a collective, audible gasp seemed to ripple through the comment section. The text flew by in a furious, unreadable stream. People were not just angry anymore, they were terrified for her. They were witnessing, live, the mechanism of a wrongful conviction being assembled right before their eyes. They were watching a man with a badge and a gun invent a crime. For Imani, this was the moment of maximum danger. The threat was no longer just verbal, it was about to become physical. She knew that once handcuffs were on her, the narrative would become infinitely more complicated. She took one small, deliberate step back, raising her hands in a clear, universally recognized gesture of non-aggression. "Officer, I am not resisting," she said, her voice ringing with clarity, projecting for the benefit of the microphone she knew was still recording. "I have not touched you. You are manufacturing a charge. This is illegal." Miller just laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Illegal? Honey, I am the law out here. Now turn around and put your hands behind your back before I put you on the ground." He started to close the distance between them. This was it, the point of no return. He had made a direct, credible threat based on a lie. He had declared his intention to commit perjury and file a false report. He had done it all with a smug sense of invincibility, secure in the belief that the only witness was his partner, who would back his story without question. He was wrong. There were 75,000 other witnesses, and one of them was his own sergeant, who at that very moment was in his patrol car, racing towards their location with his lights flashing and his sirens screaming, having heard Miller's fabricated felony charge through the tinny speaker of a dispatcher's phone that was held up to a computer monitor. Miller had just crossed a line, not realizing that the line itself was being broadcast to the entire world, drawn in the indelible pixels of a live stream that would seal his fate. He had no idea that his career in law enforcement had just ended, right there, next to a meaningless scuff mark on the bumper of his patrol car. Just as Miller took another step toward Imani, his hand outstretched to grab her arm, a sound pierced the air, shattering the tense bubble of their manufactured reality. It wasn't the distant news siren. It was much closer, much more urgent. It was the sound of his own radio, crackling to life with an explosive burst of static. The voice that came through was not the calm, measured tone of the dispatcher. It was Sergeant Reynolds, and his voice was a raw, furious roar that was distorted by the radio's speaker. "Unit 714, stand down! I repeat, Miller, Davis, stand down! Do not touch that civilian! Do not move! Acknowledge!" The command was so loud, so unexpected, that both officers froze in place. Miller's hand, which had been inches from Imani's arm, dropped to his side as if he'd been shocked. They exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated confusion. What was happening? A stand-down order was serious. To have it come directly from their sergeant, screamed over the radio, was unprecedented. Before they could even process the command, let alone respond, another sound joined the cacophony. The wail of an approaching siren, growing louder with each passing second. It was coming in fast. Miller instinctively looked down the long, empty road that led into the plaza, and his confusion morphed into disbelief. A Westlake PD cruiser was tearing down the road towards them, lights flashing, moving far faster than was safe for a parking lot. Davis spun around, his mouth slightly agape. "What the hell is going on?" he muttered, looking at Miller for an answer. But Miller had no answer. His brain was struggling to catch up with the sudden, violent intrusion of the outside world. Their private stage was being invaded. Imani remained perfectly still, her hands still slightly raised. She watched the cruiser fishtail to a stop 20 feet away, and Sergeant Reynolds burst out of the driver's side before the car had even stopped rocking. Reynolds was a man in his late 40s, with a commanding presence and a face that was currently a thunderous shade of red. He wasn't walking. He was storming towards them, his eyes locked on Miller. "What in God's name do you two think you're doing?" Reynolds bellowed, his voice echoing across the now not-so-empty parking lot. "I gave you a direct order to stand down." "Sarge, we were just—" Miller began, his voice sounding weak and uncertain. The swagger and confidence from a moment ago had completely vanished, replaced by the stammering of a child caught with his hand in the cookie jar. "Don't you sarge me, Miller," Reynolds cut him off, jabbing a finger in his direction. "I heard you. The whole damn world heard you. Felony assault? Are you out of your mind?" The phrase, "the whole damn world heard you," hung in the air. Miller and Davis looked at each other, the same terrified question dawning in their eyes. How? How could anyone have heard them? Reynolds didn't give them time to ponder it. He strode right past them and stopped directly in front of Imani. He pointedly ignored his two officers and addressed her with a professionalism that was a stark contrast to their behavior. "Ma'am, I am Sergeant Frank Reynolds. Are you all right? Have these officers harmed you in any way?" "I am unharmed, Sergeant," Imani replied, finally lowering her hands. Her voice was as calm as ever. Reynolds nodded, his jaw tight with fury. He then turned back to Miller and Davis, his eyes blazing. "Both of you, against the side of your vehicle, now!" It was an order that was so shocking, so outside the normal bounds of police procedure, that for a second, neither officer moved. They just stared at their supervisor as if he had started speaking a foreign language. "Did you hear me?" Reynolds roared. "Get against the damn car before I put you there myself." The bubble had not just been burst, it had been obliterated. The illusion of their power, their isolation, and their impunity had been stripped away in less than 60 seconds. The world had come crashing in, not with a whisper, but with a siren and the furious voice of their boss. And as they slowly, reluctantly began to move towards their own patrol car, the true, horrifying scale of their miscalculation was just beginning to dawn on them. They still didn't understand what a live stream was, but they understood the look in their sergeant's eyes. It was the look of a man who was about to end their careers. As Miller and Davis, stunned into silence, shuffled towards the side of their cruiser, Sergeant Reynolds turned his full attention back to Imani. His demeanor was one of damage control, but there was a genuine look of concern in his eyes. He had seen enough on the brief video clip to know this was a catastrophic failure on the part of his officers. "Ma'am, my name is Imani Thompson," she said, extending a hand. Her composure was so absolute that it seemed to momentarily throw Reynolds off balance. He shook her hand, his grip firm. "Miss Thompson, on behalf of the Westlake Police Department, I sincerely apologize for the conduct of these officers." "Your apology is noted, Sergeant," Imani said coolly. "But I believe we are past the point of apologies." Reynolds nodded grimly. I understand. Can you please tell me what happened here? I'd be happy to, Imani replied. But you don't have to take my word for it. She gestured with her head towards her Lexus, where the car door was still open. The entire interaction, from the moment Officer Miller approached my vehicle, has been recorded. In fact, it's still being broadcast live. She said the words, broadcast live, with a quiet, deliberate emphasis. Reynolds' eyes widened. He had heard the dispatchers say something about a live stream, but in the heat of the moment, the term hadn't fully registered. He thought maybe it was some kind of delayed upload, something that had gone viral after the fact. The idea that it was happening in real time was a new level of crisis. He took a few steps toward her car and peered inside. There it was, the smartphone, sitting in its cradle, the screen glowing. He could see the live viewer count ticking upwards, now well past 100,000. He could see the frantic scroll of the comments. He leaned closer and could hear the faint, tinny audio coming from the phone's speaker, his own voice from a few moments ago, yelling at his officers. The reality of the situation hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't just a complaint with video evidence. This was a public spectacle. Every word he said, every action he took from this point forward was also being judged by an unseen global audience. He felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple. He turned his head and looked at Miller and Davis, who were standing awkwardly by their car, watching him with expressions of growing dread. They still didn't get it. They just thought they were in trouble for being too aggressive on a stop. They had no concept of the public stage they were on. Reynolds walked back towards them, his face a grim, unreadable mask. "You two have any idea what you've just done?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Miller, ever the defiant one, tried to muster some defense. "Sarge, she was being uncooperative. We had a reportable accident and she—" "Accident?" Reynolds cut him off, his voice laced with disbelief. He pointed to the minuscule scuff on the bumper. "You're going to stand there and tell me you were prepared to arrest a woman for this? To ruin her life over this?" We thought she was acting suspicious," Davis stammered, finally finding his voice. It was a weak defense, and they all knew it. "Suspicious?" Reynolds shot back, taking a step closer to them. "Or was she just a black woman in a nice car in a neighborhood you didn't think she belonged in? Is that what this was?" The question, so direct and damning, hung in the air. Neither officer could meet his gaze. Their silence was a confession. It was then that Reynolds made the discovery that would turn a disaster into a potential criminal case for his officers. He looked back at Imani. "Ms. Thompson, is your phone still streaming?" "Yes, Sergeant, it is." He nodded, then looked back at his men. "So, when Officer Miller fabricated a felony assault charge claiming Ms. Thompson touched him, that was also broadcast to over 100,000 people." The color drained from Miller's face. His jaw went slack. Davis looked like he was going to be physically ill. The word fabricated coming from their own supervisor, combined with the incomprehensible number of 100,000 people, finally broke through their fog of arrogance and confusion. The trap wasn't the stop itself. The trap was the unseen audience. The trap was their own mouths. The discovery wasn't a scuff mark on a car. It was the shocking realization that their private abuse of power had been witnessed by the entire world. And in that moment, as they stood there under the harsh afternoon sun, they understood that their lives as police officers were over. The moments that followed Sergeant Reynolds' revelation were a blur of swift, decisive action. For Miller and Davis, the world seemed to slow down and warp, the sounds of the parking lot fading into a dull roar in their ears. The weight of what had just happened was beginning to crush them. Reynolds, however, was operating with cold, emergency room efficiency. He knew that every second he was on camera mattered. The department's reputation was hemorrhaging, and his actions were the only available tourniquet. "Miller, Davis, place your sidearms on the trunk of the cruiser. Slowly!" Reynolds commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Then give me your badges." This was the ultimate humiliation for a police officer, a public stripping of their authority and identity. Miller hesitated for a fraction of a second, a final, futile spark of defiance in his eyes. "Sarge, listen. "Don't make me repeat myself, officer," Reynolds said, his tone like ice. The use of the formal title officer instead of Miller's name was a deliberate distancing. They were no longer his guys. They were suspects in an investigation. Defeated, Miller unholstered his weapon with numb fingers and placed it on the trunk. Davis followed suit, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. They then unclipped their badges from their uniforms and handed them over to Reynolds, who took them without a word. Just then, a second and third police cruiser arrived, summoned by Reynolds as soon as he'd understood the situation. Two uniformed officers, a man and a woman, stepped out, their faces etched with confusion as they took in the bizarre scene. Two of their colleagues being disarmed by their sergeant, while a civilian woman stood watching calmly. "Sarge, what's going on?" the female officer, whose name tag read Sandoval, asked. "Officers Miller and Davis are being placed on immediate administrative leave pending an internal affairs investigation," Reynolds announced, his voice loud enough for Imani's phone to capture clearly. "You two will escort them back to the precinct. They are not to have any contact with each other. Secure their patrol car as is. The dashcam footage will be pulled as evidence." The word evidence sent another visible shudder through Davis. He looked pale and unsteady on his feet. Sandoval and her partner, professionals to the core, simply nodded and moved to flank the two disgraced officers. "Let's go, guys," Sandoval said quietly, a hint of pity in her voice. As they were led away, their heads bowed in shame, Miller couldn't resist one last, desperate glance back at Imani. His eyes were a mixture of hatred, confusion, and a dawning, terrified respect. He had picked a fight with a civilian and somehow lost in a way he never thought possible. With them gone, an almost surreal quiet descended on the parking lot once more. Reynolds let out a long, heavy sigh, the adrenaline beginning to fade, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He turned back to Imani. "Miss Thompson, He trailed off, unsure of what to say. "I'll need to get a formal statement from you," he finished lamely. "Of course, Sergeant," Imani replied. She finally walked back to her car and ended the live stream. A final message popped up on her screen before she closed the app. "Live viewers at end of stream, 187,432. She took a screenshot. More evidence. She then turned to Reynolds, her entire demeanor shifting from that of a victim to that of a legal professional. "I will provide a full statement," she said, "and I will be forwarding a copy of the entire unedited video to your Internal Affairs Division, the District Attorney's Office, and the local press. I will also be retaining it for my own records, as I will be filing a formal civil rights lawsuit against your department and officers Miller and Davis personally." Reynolds just nodded. He had expected nothing less. The justice that had begun in that parking lot was only the first step. For Miller and Davis, their ordeal was just beginning. They had been swiftly and publicly disciplined by their own command, a stunning reversal of the power they had so arrogantly wielded just minutes earlier. For Imani, it was a moment of grim vindication. She had faced down two armed men who tried to intimidate and frame her, and she had won. She hadn't used anger or violence. She had used her mind, her composure, and the ubiquitous power of a small rectangular piece of glass and metal. She had turned their intended stage of intimidation into a global courtroom, and in doing so, had delivered a verdict on their careers right there on the hot asphalt. The moment Imani ended her live stream, the digital recording didn't just disappear, it transformed. No longer a live event, it became an artifact, a shareable, downloadable, replayable piece of evidence. The 187,000 people who had been watching live became the initial apostles of the story, spreading the clip with a fervor reserved for history-making events. Within an hour, edited versions of the video began to surface. Some were short, punchy clips of the most damning moments. Davis's "people like you" comment, Miller's sneering, "I am the law out here," and the shocking climax, his on-the-spot invention of a felony assault charge. These clips were perfectly packaged for the short attention spans of social media, and they spread like wildfire. By the evening commute, the story was no longer just a viral social media post. It was breaking news. Local television stations preempted their regular programming with the headline, "Westlake police officers caught on live stream harassing attorney." They played the clips, their anchors using words like shocking, disturbing, and a serious abuse of power. The full, unedited video was uploaded to YouTube by several accounts and quickly amassed millions of views. The comment sections became global forums for outrage, debate, and disgust. People from all walks of life weighed in, from retired police officers expressing their shame and anger at the officers' conduct to legal scholars dissecting the multiple constitutional violations on display. Overnight, the story went from local to national. Major news networks like CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News picked it up, each framing it through their own particular lens, but all agreeing on the core facts. The video was damning. The hashtag #Imani Thompson was the #1 trending topic on Twitter in the United States and in the top 10 globally. Her name, which had been known only in legal and activist circles, was now on the lips of millions. The Westlake Police Department was officially in the center of a Category 5 public relations hurricane. Their phone lines were so overwhelmed that they had to set up an automated message. Their social media pages were flooded with so many angry comments that they had to disable the comment function entirely. Reporters from national newspapers and television networks began descending on the small suburban town, setting up cameras outside the police precinct, which now looked less like a community police station and more like a fortress under siege. For Miller and Davis, the nightmare was just beginning. Their names, which had been exposed by viewers who cross-referenced the video with public employee databases, were now inextricably linked to the video. Their faces were everywhere. People found their old social media profiles, digging up past posts and comments that revealed a pattern of casual bigotry and aggressive political stances. Memes were created, turning their smug, angry faces from the video into symbols of police misconduct. They had become, in the space of less than 12 hours, two of the most hated men in America. The firestorm also had a deeply personal impact. Their neighbors recognized them from the news. Friends and family members were inundated with calls and messages. The blue wall of silence, the unspoken code among officers to protect their own, began to show significant cracks. While some hardline officers grumbled about the two men being thrown to the wolves, the majority of the force was furious. Miller and Davis hadn't just destroyed their own careers, they had brought shame and intense, unwanted scrutiny upon the entire department. They had made every officer's job harder, eroding what little public trust the department had managed to build. The viral video was more than just a recording of an event. It had become a cultural moment. It was a perfect, contained drama that encapsulated a host of national anxieties about race, policing, and accountability. And it showed in stark, undeniable terms that in the modern world, there are very few places left to hide. The isolation that Miller and Davis had counted on to protect them had become an illusion, and the bright, unforgiving light of global attention was now exposing every ugly detail of their actions. The morning after the incident, the pressure on the Westlake Police Department was unbearable. The viral video had created a crisis of legitimacy that could not be ignored or downplayed. Police Chief Michael Donovan, a man just 2 years from retirement, found himself facing the biggest scandal of his 40-year career. He knew that a wishy-washy, "we are investigating" statement would not suffice. The evidence was too clear, the public outrage too immense. He had to act, and he had to act decisively. He called an emergency press conference for 10 a.m. The lawn in front of the precinct was a chaotic sea of reporters, cameras, and satellite trucks. When Chief Donovan stepped up to the podium, his face was pale and grim. He looked like a man who hadn't slept. "Good morning," he began, his voice heavy. I am here today to address the incident that occurred yesterday involving two of my officers, Kevin Miller and David Davis. I, along with millions of others, have watched the video recorded by Ms. Imani Thompson. I will not mince words. I was disgusted. I was appalled. The behavior displayed by these two men is indefensible. It does not represent the values of the Westlake Police Department, and it is a betrayal of the oath we swear to protect and serve every member of this community with fairness and respect. This was an unusually strong and immediate condemnation. Police chiefs typically speak in cautious legalese, careful not to prejudice an ongoing investigation. Donovan's bluntness was a calculated move to try and get ahead of the narrative, to show the public that the department was taking this with the utmost seriousness. As of late yesterday afternoon, he continued, Officers Miller and Davis were relieved of their duties and placed on administrative leave. I can now confirm that, pending the conclusion of the internal affairs investigation, I will be recommending their termination to the City Council. They will not wear this uniform again. A murmur went through the crowd of reporters. A recommendation for termination before the IA investigation was even complete was virtually unheard of. It was a clear signal that the blue wall of silence would not be protecting these two. Donovan was sacrificing them to save the institution. He went on to announce that the department had formally requested the district attorney's office to open a criminal investigation into the officer's conduct. The initial complaint from Ms. Thompson alleged an unlawful stop. After viewing the video, we believe there is probable cause to investigate further charges, including but not limited to filing a false report, perjury, and official misconduct. He was publicly hanging his own men out to dry, a move that sent shockwaves through the local police union. The union president would later release a statement demanding due process for the officers, but it was drowned out by the chorus of condemnation. Internally, the department was in turmoil. Sergeant Reynolds's report on the incident was scathing. He detailed not only the events captured on the live stream, but also his prior concerns about Miller's and Davis's pattern of aggressive behavior. Suddenly, old citizen complaints that had been dismissed were being re-examined with fresh eyes. It became clear that this incident wasn't an aberration, but rather the inevitable climax of a long-festering problem that leadership had failed to address meaningfully. The other officers on the force were divided. Some felt Miller and Davis got what they deserved. Others, a minority, grumbled that the chief had folded too quickly to public pressure. But all of them felt the chill. The rules had changed. The ever-present threat of a citizen's camera meant that a single bad stop could now end a career, or even lead to prison time. The traditional protection afforded by the badge had been irrevocably weakened. The department's leadership, in a desperate attempt to restore public trust, also announced mandatory department-wide retraining on de-escalation, implicit bias, and the legal parameters of traffic stops. It was a standard institutional response, but it felt different this time. The video of Imani Thompson would undoubtedly be used as the prime example of what not to do, a permanent, humiliating training tool created by two of their own. The walls that had once protected officers like Miller and Davis were not just cracking, they were crumbling under the weight of a single viral video. As the institutional fallout rained down on the Westlake Police Department, the world's focus began to shift to the woman at the center of the storm. In the initial hours of the video's virality, she was simply the woman in the Lexus, an anonymous but powerful symbol of grace under pressure. But the internet, fueled by an insatiable curiosity, quickly uncovered her identity. When the news broke that Imani Thompson was not just any citizen, but a highly respected and formidable civil rights attorney, the story took on a whole new dimension of irony and significance. It was like a gazelle, cornered by two lions, suddenly revealing itself to be a master lion tamer. Journalists flocked to the website of her small but influential law firm. Her professional biography painted a picture of a woman who had dedicated her life to fighting the very injustice she had just experienced. A graduate of Howard University School of Law, She had spent the last decade litigating against police departments, school districts, and corporations on behalf of marginalized clients. She had argued cases involving racial profiling, wrongful imprisonment, and workplace discrimination. The list of her victories was long and impressive. The revelation recontextualized the entire video. Her unshakable calm was no longer just a personality trait. It was a professional skill honed over years of courtroom battles. Her precise, legalistic language, unlawful detention, manufacturing a charge, was not something she had picked up from watching TV. It was her native tongue. Her decision to start a live stream was not a panicked, spur-of-the-moment reaction. It was a calculated, strategic move by someone who understood the power of evidence better than almost anyone. Colleagues and former clients began speaking to the media, and a consistent portrait emerged. They described Imani as brilliant, tenacious, and deeply compassionate. Imani has been fighting guys like Miller and Davis in the courtroom her whole career, one fellow attorney told a reporter. The only difference is that this time the confrontation happened in a parking lot, and the whole world was the jury. Her own statement, released through her law firm, was a masterclass in controlled force. It was brief, professional, and devoid of personal anger. On Tuesday afternoon, I was subjected to an unconstitutional stop and an attempted false arrest by 2 officers of the Westlake Police Department, the statement read. While the experience was deeply unsettling, it was, unfortunately, not unique. Countless individuals, particularly people of color, endure similar or worse encounters daily without the benefit of a camera or a law degree. My case is not just about me. It is about the systemic issues that allow such abuses of power to occur. I will be using every legal tool at my disposal to ensure that the officers involved are held fully accountable and to pursue meaningful, systemic reforms within the Westlake PD to prevent this from happening to anyone else. The statement was powerful precisely because it elevated the incident beyond a personal grievance. She positioned herself not as a victim, but as a warrior who had just been handed a powerful new weapon in a fight she was already waging. This narrative shift was devastating for the officers' fledgling defense. They could no longer try to paint her as an uncooperative or hysterical civilian. They had tried to bully one of the nation's foremost experts on bullying by law enforcement. They hadn't just picked the wrong person to harass, they had picked the one person uniquely equipped by training, temperament, and technology to dismantle their careers with surgical precision. The story was no longer just about 2 bad cops. It was about a seasoned legal gladiator who had been forced to fight on her own behalf, and in doing so, had created a teachable moment for the entire nation. With the court of public opinion having delivered a swift and brutal verdict, the formal legal battles began on 2 separate but parallel fronts. This was no longer just an internal affairs matter. It had escalated into a full-blown legal war, with Imani Thompson directing the charge. The first front was the civil case. Imani, acting as her own co-counsel alongside her law partner Marcus, filed a multi-million-dollar federal civil rights lawsuit. The defendants were listed as Kevin Miller, David Davis, Police Chief Michael Donovan, and the city of Westlake itself. The lawsuit was a legal work of art, a meticulously crafted document that laid out the violations in excruciating detail. It alleged violations of the First, Fourth, and 14th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution. The counts included unlawful search and seizure, malicious prosecution, conspiracy to deprive of civil rights, and failure to supervise, the last one aimed directly at Chief Donovan and the city's leadership. The lawsuit's primary weapon was the live stream video. The complaint included a minute-by-minute transcript of the entire encounter, with legal annotations for each constitutional violation. Miller's threat to invent a felony charge was highlighted as a clear demonstration of malice. The suit did not just seek monetary damages for the emotional distress and violation of rights Imani suffered, it demanded injunctive relief. This was the truly transformative part of the lawsuit. Imani was demanding court-mandated reforms for the Westlake Police Department, including a new, more stringent early warning system for officers with multiple complaints, revamped use of force policies, and the mandatory use of body cameras for every officer, with strict penalties for failing to activate them. She was using her personal trauma as leverage to force systemic change. The city's lawyers knew they were in an impossible position. Going to trial would mean playing that damning video in open court over and over again. They had no viable defense. A settlement was inevitable. The only question was how high the price would be. The second front was the criminal case, and in many ways, it was even more significant. After reviewing the video and Sergeant Reynolds's report, the district attorney's office moved with unprecedented speed. A grand jury was convened, and within a week, they handed down indictments against both Miller and Davis. The charges were severe. Both men were charged with filing a false police report and official misconduct, both felonies. But the DA added a more serious charge for Miller based on his on-camera lie: perjury, specifically for making a false sworn statement with the intent to initiate a baseless felony prosecution. This was a charge that carried significant prison time. The most damning charge, however, was a federal one. The local U.S. Attorney's Office, seeing the national implications of the case, stepped in and filed charges under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. This powerful federal statute makes it a crime for anyone acting with government authority to willfully deprive a person of their constitutional rights. This charge transformed the case from a local police misconduct scandal into a federal civil rights prosecution. The full weight of the Department of Justice was now coming down on two disgraced suburban cops. Miller and Davis now faced the terrifying prospect of a two-front war. On one side, a lawsuit that would likely bankrupt them. On the other, a criminal prosecution that could send them to federal prison for years. The legal system, which they had once used as a tool of intimidation, was now turning its full, inexorable power against them. They had tried to trap Imani Thompson in a lie, and now they were the ones caught in an ironclad legal trap of their own making, with no escape in sight. The announcement of both a multi-million-dollar civil suit and a federal criminal indictment marked the beginning of the end for Kevin Miller and David Davis. Their lives, once stable and propped up by the authority of a badge, began to unravel with breathtaking speed. The first domino to fall was their employment. As promised, Chief Donovan's recommendation for termination was fast-tracked. The City Council held a perfunctory hearing, and the vote was unanimous. They were officially fired, stripped of their jobs, their pensions, and the only professional identity either of them had ever known. The police union, after a brief and legally obligated defense, quietly distanced themselves, unwilling to spend political capital on a case that was so publicly toxic. They were on their own. Next came the financial ruin. Faced with a mountain of legal bills for both the civil and criminal cases, their savings evaporated within weeks. They had to hire separate defense attorneys, as their interests were no longer aligned. Each man's best defense might involve blaming the other. They took out second mortgages on their homes. Their wives, who had once been proud police spouses, were now socially ostracized, facing whispers in the grocery store and glares at school pickup lines. Davis's wife, unable to handle the public shame and the financial strain, filed for divorce a few months into the ordeal, taking their two young children with her. Miller's marriage held on by a thread, but the stress created a toxic, resentful atmosphere in their home. The social consequences were just as brutal. They had become pariahs in the very community they had once policed. People would cross the street to avoid them. Old friends stopped returning their calls. The local sports bar where Miller used to hold court after his shift now fell silent whenever he walked in. He was asked to leave more than once. They were trapped in a state of public infamy. Their names were a punchline on late-night talk shows. Their faces were synonymous with racism and police corruption. They tried to find other work, but it was impossible. A simple Google search of their names brought up an avalanche of news articles, opinion pieces, and, of course, the video itself. No one would hire them. Davis ended up taking an under-the-table job doing manual labor for a landscaping company miles away, where no one knew his face. Miller, too proud and angry to accept such a fall from grace, just stayed home, growing more bitter and isolated with each passing day. The psychological toll was immense. Davis, according to his lawyer's statements in court, fell into a deep depression, consumed by guilt and regret. He reportedly watched the video over and over, trying to understand how he had let his partner's casual cruelty escalate into a life-destroying event. He was a follower, and he had followed Miller right off a cliff. Miller's reaction was different. He didn't find regret, he found rage. He saw himself as the victim. In his warped perspective, he was a casualty of cancel culture, a good cop taken down by a liberal media and a politically motivated prosecutor. He blamed everyone but himself. He blamed Imani for tricking them. He blamed Sergeant Reynolds for not backing them up. He blamed the chief for caving to the mob. His arrogance had curdled into a potent, self-destructive poison. The two men who had stood together so smugly in that parking lot, united in their petty abuse of power, were now completely broken, each isolated in his own personal hell. Their lives had been utterly and irrevocably dismantled, not by a complex conspiracy, but by a few minutes of recorded hatred and the lies they told to cover it up. The journey through the legal system was, for Miller and Davis, a slow, grinding process of humiliation. Their defense attorneys tried every trick in the book. They filed motions to have the live stream video thrown out, arguing it was an illegal recording. It wasn't. The state had one-party consent, and it was in a public place. They tried to argue that Imani had provoked the officers with her defiant attitude. They attempted to portray Miller and Davis as overworked, stressed-out officers who had simply made a mistake in judgment. None of it worked. The video was the ultimate, unimpeachable witness. It showed everything, refuting every lie and excuse. As the trial date for the criminal charges loomed, the prosecution offered a plea deal. It was their last chance to avoid a trial that they were almost certain to lose, a trial where that video would be the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. The deal was harsh, but it was better than the maximum sentence they faced if convicted by a jury. If they pleaded guilty to the felony charges of official misconduct and, for Miller, perjury, the U.S. attorney would drop the deprivation of rights charge, streamlining the process. They would still face significant prison time, but it offered a sliver of certainty in an otherwise hopeless situation. Davis took the deal immediately. His lawyer advised him that his remorseful attitude and cooperation might earn him a slightly more lenient sentence. Miller, still clinging to his delusion of victimhood, wanted to fight. He raged at his attorney, insisting a jury would see his side of the story. It took weeks of brutal, frank conversations for his lawyer to convince him that going to trial would be an act of legal suicide. Reluctantly, bitterly, Miller finally agreed. On a cold morning in late fall, nearly a year after the incident, Kevin Miller and David Davis stood before a federal judge. They looked like hollowed-out versions of their former selves. Dressed in ill-fitting suits, they had lost weight, and their faces were etched with stress. One by one, they pleaded guilty, their voices barely audible in the packed courtroom. Before handing down the sentence, the judge, a stern, gray-haired woman named Judge Annabelle Wallace, addressed the two men directly. Her voice was cold and sharp. "I have sat on this bench for 30 years, she began, her eyes boring into them. I have seen the worst of what people can do to one another, but it is a uniquely corrosive act when the crime is committed by those who have sworn an oath to uphold the law. You did not just harass a citizen. You used your badge as a weapon to terrorize her. You did not just tell a lie. You attempted to use a lie to initiate a malicious prosecution that could have stolen years of a woman's life." She paused, letting the weight of her words fill the silent room. "You believed you were anonymous. You believed you were unaccountable. You were wrong. Your actions have stained the reputation of every decent police officer in this country. You have eroded public trust, and you have become symbols of the very corruption you swore to fight. There must be a consequence for that." She then delivered the sentence. David Davis, due to his lesser role and expression of remorse, was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. Kevin Miller, as the instigator and the one who fabricated the felony charge, received a sentence of 7 years. A wave of quiet gasps rippled through the courtroom. It was a significant sentence, sending a clear message that this kind of conduct would not be tolerated. As the marshals moved in to take them into custody, Miller's face was a mask of disbelief and rage. Davis simply wept, his shoulders shaking. The final judgment had been rendered. The legal war was over. The 2 men who had tried to put an innocent woman in a cage were now on their way to one themselves. Their final destination, a concrete cell where they would have nothing but time to reflect on the few hateful minutes in a parking lot that had cost them everything. 3 years after Miller and Davis were led away in handcuffs, the echoes of that Tuesday afternoon still reverberated. The case of Thompson v. City of Westlake had become a landmark in civil rights litigation. The city, facing insurmountable evidence, had settled the civil suit for a staggering $8.5 million. But more importantly, they had agreed to the sweeping reforms Imani had demanded in her lawsuit. The Westlake PD was now operating under a federal consent decree, a court-monitored agreement to overhaul its practices. Every officer now wore a body camera, and the footage was subject to random audits. The department's early warning system for problematic officers, nicknamed Imani's Law by local activists, was adopted as a model by other police departments across the state. The training curriculum was completely rewritten, with the full, unedited video of Imani's stop becoming a mandatory part of every police cadet's education. A permanent lesson in how quickly and disastrously a situation can spiral when bias and arrogance are in command. Imani Thompson, for her part, used her newfound national platform not for personal gain, but to amplify her life's work. She channeled a significant portion of her settlement money into a non-profit foundation that provided legal aid to victims of police misconduct and funded community-led oversight programs. She became a sought-after voice on cable news and in congressional hearings, always steering the conversation away from her own story and towards the broader systemic issues. She spoke with a calm authority that captivated audiences, never raising her voice, but always making her point with devastating clarity. She had turned one of the worst moments of her life into a catalyst for tangible, lasting change. The parking lot at the Northwood Professional Plaza was no longer anonymous. It had become a quiet, unofficial landmark. People would sometimes drive there, pausing in the spot where Imani had parked, reflecting on the story that had unfolded on that small patch of asphalt. It was a testament to the idea that sometimes, against all odds, justice could prevail. It's easy to look at the story of Kevin Miller and David Davis and see it as a simple case of good versus evil, of racists getting their just desserts. But the truth, as always, is a little more complex. What drives 2 men sworn to uphold the law to commit such a brazen act of malice in broad daylight? It wasn't just a sudden burst of bigotry. It was the product of a slow-growing rot. It begins with a sense of entitlement, the belief that the badge grants them a status above the citizens they serve. It's nurtured by a culture of cynicism, the us versus them mentality that can fester within a police department, where every civilian is a potential suspect. For Miller, the alpha in the duo, it was likely fueled by a fragile ego, a need to constantly assert his dominance, especially when faced with someone like Imani, whose confidence and success challenged his own preconceived notions of the world's hierarchy. Davis was the more passive enabler, the one who went along, perhaps out of loyalty, perhaps out of fear of being seen as weak by his partner. Their actions weren't a sudden break from character, they were the character itself, revealed when they thought no one of consequence was watching. Their mistake was not understanding that in our hyper-connected world, someone is always watching. And what about Imani? We celebrate her strength, but it's crucial to ask what might have happened if things had been slightly different. What if she hadn't been a civil rights attorney, armed with a deep knowledge of her rights? What if she had panicked, yelled, or even tried to flee? The officers would have used that as justification for the very escalation they were itching for. What if her phone battery had been dead, or the cell signal in that parking lot too weak for a stable stream? The entire event would have vanished into the ether, becoming just her word against two police officers, a battle an ordinary citizen almost never wins. Her victory was not just a victory for justice, but a confluence of courage, preparation, privilege, and luck. It's a sobering reminder that while technology can be a powerful equalizer, it is not a suit of armor. The best way to protect ourselves is to foster communities that demand accountability, and to support systems that make it harder for the Kevin Millers of the world to thrive in the first place. This story serves as a powerful parable for our modern age. It's about how a single moment of hatred can unravel a lifetime. It's about the immense courage it takes to stand firm in the face of injustice. And it's about the undeniable truth that our actions, big and small, have consequences that can ripple out far beyond our sight. What do you think is the most important lesson from Imani's story? And how do you think we can better support people who face these kinds of injustices without the resources she had? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story resonated with you, please subscribe for more content that explores the fight for justice.